So, with that being said, with espresso in hand, let's get this started. So today's discussion is going to focus on our favorite topic again, imperialism in Africa. Now, first off, it's important to understand Africa, before imperialism. Pre-1885, for the most part, Africa was populated on the fringes. Okay, northern Africa had experienced quite a bit of settlement. Obviously, the Egyptian Empire goes quite a ways back. Not to mention that northern Africa was a stone's throw away across that great connecting point known as the Mediterranean. But really, up until the 14, 15, 1600s, Africa was settled by, what a novel concept, Africans. That makes sense. However, with the age of exploration, Europeans began to make their way around the perimeter of the African continent. But for the most part, Africa didn't really see any Europeans venture into the interior. For whatever reason, there wasn't really a whole lot that Europeans were interested in there. They were looking to get to India, they were looking to get to China, and Africa, for the most part, was a place where you could stop, you could refuel, maybe do a little bit of trading, but for the most part, there wasn't anything there that they were interested in. However, the age of imperialism is going to change all of that. So pre-1885, Africans lived in tribes. They had no established political borders. They were small unit government and cultural systems. And then what happens? In the Congress of Berlin in 1885, not only was the war between Russia, between the Russian Empire, and between the Ottoman Empire settled, and our friends from the very southern reaches of Russia were joined back to the Russian Empire, along with that, Africa was partitioned. And 14 European nations are going to divide the continent up into political areas. Now, keep in mind, along with imperialist ideas, they did not consult Africans. Okay? They didn't ask Africans how they wanted to be divided up. They didn't care. They were interested in the benefits of European countries. That's what they were looking at. And they were trying to stop countries from coming into contact with each other and fighting wars over territorial gains. Now, by 1914, at the start of World War I, over 90% of the African continent was directly controlled by Europeans. That's an astounding number. That is huge. And so that's the reach that imperialism will ultimately have. So what are the effects of imperialism in Africa? Well, first off, much of it was done for industrial purposes. So as I've talked about before, it's a source of new markets for finished products and sources of raw materials. But Europeans are also going to migrate to those colonies as well. And we talked about with the Industrial Revolution when we played the urban game, specifically in England, land was very valuable. It was in short supply, and that's why the enclosure movement happened. They took those village commons that were set aside for everybody, and they started taking those lands, dividing them up, and selling them off. That way there would be more land for wealthier people. So, there was that lack of land for poor people, so they of course moved to the cities looking for work. Well, that doesn't go away. So European countries are going to, like Great Britain, when they have colonies, they will send people to the colonies to help populate them, but also because they wanted land, because they wanted access to resources. So Europeans will migrate to these colonies. Now that's going to have a big impact because there will be schools that will be established. They'll teach European culture, they're going to teach European languages, and they're going to teach the Christian religion. And so those selected few Europeans that had special privileges in these countries will send their children to these European schools. Now, there will be some examples of others, for example, native Africans that will send their children to these schools as well, but typically the only way you would be allowed to do that is if you were high up within the government of that particular country. Another effect of imperialism in Africa is that native Africans are going to be used as a cheap source of labor. They're also going to have to pay taxes. For example, we looked at colonialism in Kenya. They had to pay a hut tax every year. That was a tax that went directly to the imperialist country. And yes, you could say, of course, there were benefits. Sometimes they built up the infrastructure like the roads, the railroads. They put electricity in. They helped to modernize those countries. But it was done against their free will, and that's really the key here when it comes to imperialism. It was decided by somebody else. But Africans are going to work. They're going to toil. And they're not going to get a lot of protection. You know, who's going to work in the mines? It's not going to be the white Europeans. It's going to be the Africans that will do that. Another negative effect of imperialism is that in Africa is that African traditions will decline. Some will blend with European culture. Okay, so they will take on other aspects of that culture. And so culture in these African countries will definitely change. A great example of this is South Africa. Now, South Africa still has a majority native population. Okay, and again, they lived in tribes, so there are different tribes that have lived there. And when the Dutch came to South Africa, they settled for a while, and then the English took it over as a colony. So it has a blend. They call it the Boer culture. So South Africa kind of has its own version of Dutch and English language, but they also have many native Africans. It all kind of blends together. Okay. Another effect, there were elite Africans that were educated in Europe. Now, what's the key of this? They receive this education about liberty, about equality, about freedom, philosophical ideas, and they're going to bring those ideas back to their native country, which will help spread nationalistic ideas. Again, that's about its own effect of it.
And really, the final big effect of imperialism in Africa is that Africa will continue to be dominated by European countries through World War I, all the way up through World War II, and even in some instances into the 1950s and 1960s. So this domination does not stop with where we say, oh, the age of imperialism is over with World War I. It continues on. And in fact, even after many of those countries will win their independence, there are many aspects of this age of imperialism that will last. Okay, go anywhere in Western Africa, and you're very, very likely that you'll hear the French language spoken. In fact, I had a tour guide yesterday who took us around some of the older parts of Paris. Took us by the Louvre and by the National Military Museum and places like that. And I saw her again today, and we had just been chatting, and she talked about how she wasn't originally from Paris. She was from a place called the Alsace, Alsace region of France, which is close to the German border, which we'll talk about later on with World War I and World War II. But she talked about how when she was a kid, she actually moved to Africa, and she lived there throughout her young elementary years and into high school, and her dad had gotten a job there because of those French connections. Okay, and she talked about later on how she traveled to Laos and Cambodia, and how Laos was one of the most beautiful countries that she had ever seen, sailing up the Mekong River. Again, Laos speaks French. They serve crepes, which is a French treat, in Laos and in Vietnam. So those imperial influences will continue on throughout time. So that is your lecture on imperialism in Africa. Thanks for watching, and remember, never stop learning.